Hello and welcome to Cyber Focus, your source for international business information. My name is Tim Smith and you're watching our series on business and peace. Our guest today is John Sullivan. John is an adjunct professor with George Mason University and an independent consultant in international development. He is the retired executive director of the Center for International Private Enterprise, or CIPE, an affiliate of the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, which aims to strengthen democracy around the globe through private enterprise and market-oriented reform. He retired as executive director early this year after 3 decades at CIPE. He is also the author of numerous publications on the transition to democracy, ethics, corporate governance, and market-oriented democratic development. Today, Mr. Sullivan will speak about his experience at CIPE and his perspective on how corporate governance and democratic development can advance peace. John, thank you so much for joining us today.
Delighted. Thank you for having me.
You began your career working to develop minority business programs with the Institute for Economic Research and the Office of Minority Business Enterprise. How did this experience lead to you pursuing the topic of corporate governance and democratic reform?
Well, when I was just out of graduate school, this was shortly after the Watts riots and the tremendous turmoil that the United States was going through in that period. And I really wanted to play a role, so I moved to Los Angeles, to the city of Watts, which is a central part of the city where the riots had occurred, to look at the issue of, and this was at the time when President Nixon had started the Minority Enterprise Program. The idea being that minority enterprise and advancement through business could be part of the civil rights movement.
Okay.
And in fact, many of the civil rights leaders had come to the conclusion that without an economic component, we weren't going to get to civil rights. And I firmly believed that. And so that led me to looking at trying to start individual firms and the idea of entrepreneurship, which is vital. But I quickly came to the conclusion after a year or two of working there that it wasn't going to happen until the overall economic environment and the legal and regulatory system was corrected. That the firms that were starting were simply leaving Watts. They were moving to the valley, they were moving outside of the Los Angeles basin because you couldn't do business in Watts. And there's a term, it's called the dollar turning over. And normally in a community, the dollar turns over about 7 times before it leaves the community. It means it exchanges from one merchant to another, from one merchant to an employee, etc. The dollar was turning over once in Watts. Wow. And that gives you an idea, 1 versus 7, as to how bad the situation was. So I left to try to work at the U.S. Chamber of Commerce on the overall idea of systemic economic reform to create this environment of entrepreneurial opportunity.
You've been involved with CIPE since 1983, its inception.
Right.
Could you talk about how your experience with CIPE has informed your perspective on the role of business in peace?
Sure. When we got started with CIPE, this was as a result of an initiative that President Reagan had started. Okay. He gave a great speech, it's one of his landmark speeches, in Westminster to the members of the British Parliament. And in that speech he called for the United States to work through the private sector, meaning not just companies, but universities, political parties, media, etc., on building the infrastructure of democracy. And at this point in time, we were thinking that building that infrastructure would advance the cause of conflict reduction, would it create a more prosperous, stable society. So working on that and then working on the study group and saying, okay, what are the causes of the lack of democracy around the world, authoritarianism and so on. We came to countries like Peru and Colombia where there were violent insurgencies. The Philippines is another example. And beginning to work on these, we realized that building, again, like my experience in Watts, building the institutions was absolutely vital. And so that's how we developed our program in advance of and to fulfill President Reagan's call for the infrastructure. We saw the role of the private sector building the legal and regulatory infrastructure that would create commerce and opportunity.
So how did you do now, looking back over your tenure with CIPE? What would you share with us today?
Well, we've had some successes. We've had some real successes. Good. One of them being, again, I come back to Peru. There was a country that in 1983-84 saw the rise of the Shining Path, Sendero Luminoso, a violent Marxist insurgency. Today, it is one of the fastest growing countries in Latin America, largely due to the work of one of our early partners, Hernando de Soto. Hernando created the Institute for Liberty and Democracy, ILD, in Peru, and he identified the problem of the informal sector. The fact that entrepreneurs, many of them, up to a third of the population, were locked out of the economy by the overregulation, the wall of red tape, the corruption, the cronyism that occurred. Unraveling that and putting together an open market economy created what we see today with a country that's growing at 6 and 7% and does not have a violent insurgency. And in fact, the head of that insurgency, a man by the name of Abimel Guzman, was the one that said De Soto destroyed the Shining Path. So there's the power of ideas.
Indeed, thank you. You've stated in your publications that corporate governance is at the very heart of the development of both a market economy and a democratic society.
Right.
Could you elaborate on how you see this relationship playing out in developing countries?
Sure. We first started working on corporate governance right after the fall of the wall, 1989. We were beginning our work in Central and Eastern Europe. There was really no point before to try to promote market economies, deregulation, entrepreneurship in those societies as long as communism was ruling the systems. Sure, you saw some goulash communism, small business communism, small business entrepreneurship, goulash entrepreneurship in Hungary and a few other countries, but that was the exception, and it was very contained. But once the wall fell, we began working there, but we quickly realized they were talking about privatizing this horde of state-owned enterprises that they had. And we quickly realized, and I ended up in a conversation with Václav Klaus at that time, who later became Prime Minister he was the finance minister, later became Prime Minister of the Czech Republic. If you're going to privatize these companies, who's going to run them? How are they going to be governed? How are they going to be steered? When we think of the word governance, go back to the Greek, it means to steer. And so how are that going to be done? So we put together our first projects together with the Soros Foundation in Hungary and in the Czech Republic on corporate governance. Later, when we went to the Middle East with these ideas, using the OECD principles of corporate governance, which we worked on and helped develop.
Okay.
But we took them then to Egypt in the 90s, late 90s, and we were holding a conference there. And during the conference, a number of the leaders came to me and said, "John, people can't understand what's going on here." And I said, "Why not? We have the OECD, they're talking about the principles of corporate governance. They said, but if they don't speak English, they can't understand." I said, "Why not? We have the best translators. These are horribly expensive." And they said to me, "There's no word for governance in Arabic."
My goodness.
It hit me like a bolt out of the blue.
Yeah.
So we work with the Egyptian banking industry, with Al-Azhar, the leading center for Islamic thought in Cairo, Al-Azhar University, Al-Azhar Church, and with the Arab League and the Arab Linguistics Institute. It took 2 years, but they finally developed a word for governance. And this is a great game changer in the Middle East. The word now is Hawkama. And there is a brilliant institute in Dubai called the Hawkama Institute, which is supported by the government of Dubai and the UAE. But it's spread throughout the region, and you find institutes, you find corporate governance. We helped develop the first code of corporate governance in Cairo. And again, this was a ground changer. Nobody had thought about letting the Egyptian companies govern themselves. No, they were governed. No,
Yes.
governance.
That's fascinating.
And it was a major ground changer. There is a country, though, that still doesn't have a good word for governance, which we've tried and tried to figure out, but we haven't been able to yet. If anybody has an idea, would be welcome. Russia. They use corporate surveillance.
Yes. We'll save that for another discussion, John, perhaps, but thank you. With that same topic, could you elaborate on how the relationship might play out in an already developed country? What goals should they have in building a sound system of corporate governance?
One of the fundamental goals, and if we're talking about fully developed countries, OECD level, maybe not quite so important, although still important. But if you're talking about the countries, the emerging markets that have done well and are doing better, one of the fundamental issues of corporate governance is to combat corruption. Corporate governance, and I did a little publication for the International Finance Corporation, corporate governance is at the heart of an anti-corruption program. Because you've got to create incentives and mechanisms and structures for the companies to look at their employees, to work with their employees. It starts with the tone at the top, meaning the CEO.
Okay.
But you have to have systems put in place. We developed a project in Thailand, which is really well done, and they're making great progress of creating certification programs for Thai companies. The incentive is that if you develop good governance systems, business ethic programs, anti-corruption standards, audits, you can then get certified, and it becomes far easier to get into international value chains. Doing business and creating an economic incentive for good governance and anti-corruption is the name of the game.
That's great, John. And then it can actually permeate and become the new culture in the country.
Absolutely.
That's great. Well, John, thank you so much for coming in to speak with us today.
Great. Thank you for having me. It's great.
That's all for this edition of Cyber Focus. Thank you for tuning in. If you have any comments or suggestions for future topics, please let us know at CIBER, that's CIBER, at indiana.edu.